For my first PlayStation video, I wanted to make sure I picked a big game, and they do not come much bigger than Tekken. One of the earliest 3D polygon based games of the genre, Tekken was Namco's answer to Virtua Fighter and was designed by Seishi Ishii, who himself was also Virtua Fighter's designer when he worked at Sega previously. The game was developed on the purpose-built low-cost System 11 board based on PlayStation hardware. Released into arcades in the West round about 1995, it was a game that I could never find in arcades anywhere in the UK. Every time I seen this game, it was in a bowling alley. Now, some conspiracy theorists may conclude that it was some kind of global conspiracy brought about by Sega. But really, when I think back on it, all of Namco's big titles from this time, Ridge Racer, Time Crisis and Soul Edge, all of these games I found in bowling alleys or pubs, and I never once seen them in an arcade. Maybe it was Namco themselves who were targeting the more casual audience or something. Tekken was not originally conceived as a fighting game. The project began as an internal Namco test case for animating 3D character models, and eventually incorporated texture mapping similar to that found in Namco's 1993 racing game Ridge Racer. Namco's research managing director Sagishi Nakamura had met with Sony Computer Entertainment head Ken Kutaragi in 1993 to discuss the preliminary PlayStation specifications, with Namco subsequently developing the Namco System 11 arcade board based on PlayStation hardware, and Tekken is their answer to Sega's popular Virtua Fighter. Tekken was initially planned for the Namco System 22, the board used by Ridge Racer, but after Namco heard Sega was developing Virtua Fighter 2 for their new Sega Model 2 arcade board, the development of Tekken was later moved to the System 11. Tekken was intended to be a fundamentally similar title to Sega's, with the addition of detailed textures and twice the frame rate at about 60 frames per second. Originally released for the arcades in December of 1994, followed by a global release soon after, it was the first arcade game to use this system board. This game is always compared to Virtua Fighter, and why not? I mean, they are both 3D polygon fighters, but there are some not so subtle differences that make them stand apart. Firstly, whenever I seen this cabinet, it was always 50p a go, compared to the £1 a go of Virtua Fighter. This game was certainly better value for money. Secondly, the fighting is vastly different. Virtua Fighter had this weight and counter approach to the fighting, and used popular fighting styles that were easily recognisable. Although some of the moves were incredibly tough to execute, it did feel very rewarding when mastered. Tekken, on the other hand, had a more forgiving moveset, and from a technical standpoint, was less fiddly than Virtua Fighter. But I think, regardless of one person's opinions, you will get people who prefer Tekken to Virtua Fighter, and vice versa. And besides, there is no point in having a fight over it. They were both good games in their own right, and it probably came down to what console you owned that dictated your preference. Personally, I'm a Virtua Fighter guy. I have always preferred Virtua Fighter, but that's not to say I didn't enjoy playing Tekken as I did. In fact, I played Tekken more in the arcades than I played Virtua Fighter in the arcades, but that was purely down to price. The visual style of Tekken is very different from Virtua Fighter. By the time this came out in arcades, Virtua Fighter 2 was already out, and that game just looked bloody glorious. Tekken seemed a little rougher around the edges, but the detail on the characters is impressive throughout. They just looked a little rough. And speaking of the characters, some of them seem out of this world, like Jack with his massive arms, and Yoshimitsu looking like some alien robot, and then we have King with his animal head. This game certainly had more of that fantasy sci-fi look to its characters. And of course there was this guy who done this amazing impression of a power drill when he won.
You win. Round 2. Fight. Ha!
The soundtrack in this game is impressive, but again, by this time, sound and sound effects were all more natural sounding, and it was a real surprise to find a game with a crappy soundtrack or rubbish sound effects. But overall, the whole look and feel of the game did look like a cheaper alternative to Virtua Fighter. The title screen looked cheap. The fight announce screen looked awful. The high score table looked like it had crashed and everything was out of line. But it's the playability that matters. And Tekken is a fantastic fighter. But before I wax lyrical about it, I do have one common complaint amongst Polygon fighters. They all seem so serious. There is no beat up avatar between bouts, no trash talking. The fight ends and the next one immediately starts up. Another thing with 3D fighters is there is no score. Your place on the table is dictated to by the time it took or how long you lasted in the game. It's not a criticism, just an observation. But I do miss the trash talking. Anyway, gameplay wise, this is a fantastic fighter. I will be honest, it wasn't much to boast about in single player, but in 2-player, it was just brilliant. My mate described the fighting as one button per limb, due to the layout of the buttons, which, I have to be honest, I never spotted at first. I thought it was weak on the left and strong on the right. Not that it mattered a whole hell of a lot when you're knocking hell out of the buttons to beat your mates up. And some of these moves looked mightily impressive, and they were not too difficult to execute at all, especially Yoshimitsu's sword stab, which could remove about 50% of a life bar, and all it took was back twice and attack. But timing it to actually connect with your opponent was the hard part. The roster was varied enough, and some characters seemed easier to get to grips with than others. I did have a few favourites though. Kazuya, Yoshimitsu and the Law were my go-to characters in this game. I guess, looking back at it now, it seems so obvious why the game was better as a two-player. When you factor in where it was most likely to be found, in pubs and bowling alleys, than having a game that people would literally line up to put in their 50p for each go. It just made it a real coin muncher. Tekken was modestly successful for Namco, but probably its greatest success came on the Sony PlayStation. Namco had this thing about games on the PlayStation. Ridge Racer included Galaga at boot up to play, and Tekken included another. The other thing Namco done for their PlayStation ports was include a fantastic intro, one that wasn't seen on the arcades, and this intro was brilliant in my opinion. The other brilliant thing about this port was the visuals. They are almost identical to the arcade cabinet, and they look brilliant at home on a little 14-inch TV that I had at the time. I remember being well impressed, and this game was an outstanding game to showcase the power of the PlayStation. The sound was obviously brilliant as well. The music, the sound effects, and they even get this guy's impression spot on as well. Thankfully, as this game came with a manual, it was time to discover how to properly execute the moves. And me and my mates would play this game a whole shed load when I got it in the winter of 1995. In the UK, the winter of 1995 was brutally cold. It was so cold that some people with diesel cars couldn't get their car started as the fuel had frozen. And I have to laugh at this now, looking back at it. My mates had went out for a smoke with Mary Jane, and they wanted to smoke a bong on the frozen football pitch. The problem was that when they filled the bong with water, they got interrupted by a dog walker. So naturally the bong was placed on the ground behind a hedge. But that dog walker hung about the pitch for about 20 minutes, and when he did leave, the bong was frozen solid, and my mate was complaining his eyes were beginning to freeze. So we retreated back to mine and fired up Tekken on a versus session with a few beers. And it was at that moment that I truly started to appreciate Tekken and seen it as the serious alternative to Virtua Fighter. Especially as me and my mates were all kind of noobs on it. No one had enough ability to stand out, so the fighting was much closer than it would have been on, say, Street Fighter 2. The port of Tekken on the PlayStation was a defining moment for the PlayStation in the UK. Sony were seen as the upstarts, accused of buying their way into the video game market. But the PlayStation was way cooler than the Saturn. The Saturn was seen as a toy, but the PlayStation was seen as a lifestyle accessory. Put it this way, I ended up back in many a student's flat over those years between 95 and 96, and 9 times out of 10 there was a PlayStation under the TV. Video games had matured, and Sony made them cool. And more people bought PlayStations, and the Saturn was starting to fall behind. And Tekken became the new de facto 3D fighter for the 18 to 25 demographic.
You win. Round 2. Fight. KO. You win. Round 1. Fight.
Tekken is a game that still divided opinion to this day, and the original has not aged well, especially when compared to Virtua Fighter. But back then, it always did look cheaper. But gameplay wise, there are better games than Tekken now, and it seems quite rigid and clunky. But for me, it's the memories of the carefree days that the game always brings back to the fore. And for that reason alone, I still adore this game on the PlayStation. And that was my look back at Tekken. If you like this video, then please do give me a sub and a thumbs up, or even a comment or two below about your memories of Tekken on any format. And as always, a massive thank you to all of those who have subscribed and commented on my channel. Your feedback and support really does go a long way in helping the channel grow, and I do appreciate all of the support. So thank you from me. And that's all from me, folks. Thanks for watching.
You lose. Continue. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Game over.